bonjour, bonjour. Merci d'être venu ici aujourd'hui. Now that's the end of my French. 40 ans. It hardly seems possible. I am grateful for the opportunity to speak about these years as part of your distinguished conferences at the Institut Emilie du Châtelet. I am honored, truly honored, to be with you. Your generous invitation also gives me a chance to pay tribute to the memory of Emilie du Châtelet herself, that formidable philosopher, that formidable mathematician, that woman who seized life so boldly before her death at 43. Merci bien, merci bien, merci bien for permitting me to speak in English. And my deep thanks to François Barrett-Ducrot and Marie-Claire Pasquier for translating my remarks. I could not have better translators. And please be assured that it is far more salubrious to read me in French than to listen to my French. I would also like to acknowledge and say hello to the many colleagues in this room, too many to name, but we met at conferences that I will mention lately, but all the colleagues who are here today, who have done so much, so much for the study of women and gender in France. And Sylvie Blumenkranz, where are you, Sylvie? Sylvie, thank you for your great help to me. Now, I am obviously a linguistically impaired American. This is not in the translation, but there is a woman in this room that heard me at a conference in France. It might have been you, Lillian, who said, "Please, Kate, it is easier for us to hear you in translation than to hear your accent in French." But a linguistically impaired American. In the late 1970s, or perhaps the early 1980s, Hélène Sixouf and her mother were having tea in an apartment in Greenwich Village in New York City that my life partner, Elizabeth Wood, her 4 young children, and I were sharing. The children found our visitors enthralling. They were polite, but their enchantment was palpable. As the visitors sat on a brown couch, the grown-ups attempted to speak about life and feminism and feminist theory and Elaine's mother's work as a midwife in North Africa. When it was time to say goodbye, Elaine turned to me and said, "You are the most American person I know." Compliment? Insult? She startled me.
Could you speak up a little?
All right, better?
More.
More? Closer. Better? Okay. Okay? Okay. All right. Okay. Elaine startled me. I thought I was no longer obviously an American. Elaine forced me to stop writing off my national identity and instead to write it down. My remarks today fall into 2 parts. Both will have an American perspective. Perhaps both are myths of origins.
It's fine.
Okay. The first will provide a brief overview of the evolution of the study of women, sex, and gender during the last decades. In the language of film, it will be an establishing shot. The second part will be more personal. It will tell what I attempted to do and why I did so. Again, in the language of film, it will be a close-up. The words that perhaps best describe my hopes are those from an Adrian Rich poem, Planetarian. Rich is imagining Carolyn Herschel, an astronomer, and the poem begins, a woman in the shape of a monster in the shape of a woman, the skies are full of them. And the poem ends, I am an instrument in the shape of a woman trying to translate pulsations into images for the relief of the body and the reconstruction of the mind. I shivered when I first read these lines and have never forgotten them. Now, part one. The intellectual origins of women's studies in the United States after World War II is le deuxième sexe, the second sex. No question about it. American feminists have stolen from the second sex ever since. It was badly translated into English. It has its flaws. It is the starting point. For it provided a comprehensive account of women's subordination to men and severed that subordination from fate, destiny, and divine will. Now, fortunately, in the 1950s and early 1960s, some researchers in the American social sciences and sciences were also establishing streams of thought that would flow into the delta of women's studies. They enhanced and freed up the study of sexual practices, identities, and discourses. And these researchers included the sexologist Alfred Kinsey, the anthropologist Margaret Mead, the sociologist Mira Komarovsky, who explored the concept of sex roles, and John Money, the psychologist, who took the term gender from linguistics and used it to describe the sexual identities, families, and medical regimes assigned to infants and children. Is Money known in France?
Whom?
Is the work of John Money known in France?
Yes,
It depends on the circle.
yes, it is. It is.
In a dark and constant irony of history, the shedding of blood prepares the ground for change. In the United States, the 1960s were such an awful commingling of death and renewal. More specifically, the year 1963 illustrates this truth. For it was a decade that brought greater justice and equity. 1963 was the setting of the passing of the Equal Pay Act, mandating equal pay for equal work, regardless of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. It was the year of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. The Black Civil Rights organized the Great March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King spoke. Charlene Hunter became the first black woman to enroll at the previously segregated University of Georgia. And yet, in 1963, white bigots bombed a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, and murdered 4 little girls who were at Sunday school. Fannie Lou Hamer was savagely beaten because she sought to register black voters in Mississippi. Medgar Evers, the black civil rights leader, and President John F. Kennedy were assassinated in the same year. Blood, change. Blood, change. The academic movements that named and organized themselves in the United States during this dreadful decade and immediately afterwards began with a sense of group injustice. A sense of group injustice that they sought to document, using as many voices inside and outside of the academy as possible. Their members then found a place within the academy from which to challenge their marginality, powerlessness, and suffering, and through which to document the value of their group. The pioneer was Black Studies. Women's Studies, also called Feminist Studies, was next and grew rapidly, perhaps because of the number of women in the academy. And this was followed by Asian American Studies, Chicano Studies, Latino-Latina Studies, and Native American Studies. Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978 marks the beginning of the more global post-colonial studies, and later disability studies extended this restructuring of academic life. Academic life organized not around a genre, not around a method, not around a nation, not around a language. Rather, academic life organized around a demographic or a political presence. In the 1960s and 1970s, women's studies explored the question of difference between women and men in 3 ways. And participants in each way had to debate, often passionately, whether they were essentialists, who argued that women shared some characteristics other than a uterus or ovaries, or whether they were constructivists, who argued that various societies designed and determined what being a woman meant. Later, Judith Butler's brilliant theory of gender as performance would largely replace constructivism. And with varying degrees of explicitness, American feminism provided all 3 ways with intellectual energy, insights, and a moral and political framework. Of the 3 ways, the first was to expose and then seek to transform the harmful differences between men and women that are the consequences of men's domination over women, the consequences of hierarchical, patriarchal structures, and of phallocentrism. Male power expressed, why am I using the past tense? Male power expresses itself in income, access to literacy and education, holding of power, public office, and cultural authority. And this was the passionate argument of the feminine mystique, and later of sexual politics. The second approach to the differences between men and women was to reveal what women have done, and continue to do despite male dominance. The work of the historian Gerda Lerner, an immigrant to the United States, and the psychologist Carol Gilligan, especially her book In a Different Voice, was influential. For women had created culture, had built institutions, had raised families in difficult circumstances, and devised coping mechanisms. And when it entered the United States, some of the work of French theoreticians and writers was thought to ask not only about women's difference in actions and social experience, but also about women's difference, la différence, in being. Again, let me insert this. There are those of you in this room who know what a ferment in the United States the introduction of French theory caused. Many, many fights. I think all the women in this room who work with the state remember those fights. The third approach, which women of color pioneered, and which many in women's studies were slow in discerning, asked about diversity. The differences among women. Those of race, class, age, religion, sexuality, and nationality. And I am grateful to the women of color who guided me in this process of discernment. The necessary recognition of diversity roiled the study of the differences between powerful men and less powerful women. For a white woman might be under the rule of the men in her family, but rule over enslaved black men and women. And in the 1980s, the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw offered the concept of intersectionality. Carrefour? Carrefour?
Non, intersectionnalité en français.
Okay.
It's the same word.
Ah, it signified a psychological space or sense of identity in which various markers of identity, such as race and gender, could reside together, given sufficient self-consciousness and resilience. Now, helping to save women's studies.
Could you speak up a little? Because
It's still.
the acoustic is not.
All right, is this better? Yeah.
But it's always the case in this,
All right.
in this room. It's
My
not your
apology.
fault, it's the room's fault.
Okay. Room, help us. Helping to save women's studies in the United States from parochialism was the fact that many women did not study in the United States. Literary scholars, political scientists, anthropologists, economists, a goodly number resided outside of the United States, had international or global networks, spoke languages other than English, and appreciated cultures other than the American. Moreover, the United States had many scholars who had been born elsewhere. And of the international conferences, perhaps the most wide-ranging was on women and national development, held at Wellesley College in June 1976. It brought together women from Africa, Asia, Europe, North and Latin America. And paralleling it were the United Nations Conferences on Women, which we began in Mexico City in 1975. But many of us in the room remember the very important Moulin conferences of American and European feminists held in 1979 and 1980 and 1982. And three of us Americans were privileged to be invited to a conference at Toulouse in 1982. Together, these conferences, colloquia, assemblies, demonstrated both the diversity among women and common concerns about women and children that were to grow in intensity and gain wider support. What are the commonalities? The need for universal literacy and education, the need for maternal and neonatal health, the need for freedom from violence and rape, the need for an end to sexual trafficking, the need for economic well-being, the need for environmental justice. In brief, women's rights are human rights.
Excuse me for interrupting you again, Kate,
No.
but I can see that some people here. Pardon, excuse-moi en français.
No.
Je vois que certaines d'entre vous n'ont pas de texte traduit. Il y a de nombreuses personnes qui sont assises seules. La collaboration féministe dont Kate a déjà un peu parlé, dont elle parlera, vous pourrez vous inviter à partager pendant le temps de cette conférence le texte que vous avez à 2 ou peut-être même à 3. Voilà, donc je suis désolée, on pensait que plus d'entre vous sauraient parler anglais. Voilà, Ça va? Are you alright? Marie-Jo Bonnet n'a pas de texte. Pardon?
Ma voisine en a.
Alors peut-être que vous pouvez le partager. Au moins pendant la conférence. Ok, on continue. Si vous voulez, on pourra en tirer d'autres exemplaires. Voilà.
Okay. Though the focus of women's studies was on women, increasingly seen in all their diversity, it was hard to look at women without looking at men. And in the late 1970s, women's studies stimulated the development of men's studies, which examined men's life and the construction of masculinity and masculinities. Though men's studies provoked some titters, and though it never gained the international presence of women's studies, it remains a serious enterprise. However, others were urging us not just to look at women as a group and men as a group, but at the ways in which the conceptual, legal, socio-political, and cultural relations among men and women locked together to form a gender system. In 1975, Gail S. Rubin had explicitly written of the sex-gender system, and those of you who were at the Moulin conferences will remember Gail Rubin, about this high. Not intellectually. In 1981, very brilliant woman. In 1981, Myra Jalen called on feminist critics to be radical comparativists. And I know many of you in this room know Myra and her work. Myra asked us to look side by side at male and female literary traditions, male and female innovations, and align gender theory and Afro-American criticism. Valerie Smith showed us how to read slave narratives by black men and black women in this way. And such important historians as Carol Smith Rosenberg and Joan W. Scott were exploring gender. The move was so pervasive and so intelligent that many in women's studies feared the rise of gender studies. They feared that gender studies would eliminate women as a central focus of study and women's lives as a subject of deep, lasting social change. The summer 1987 issue of Signs took as its theme, Within and Without Women, Gender, and Theory, and asked, anxiously, should women's studies yield to gender studies? This question is by no means settled, or even sharply defined. Given the stress that you've just mentioned, of feminism on collaboration over conflict, it is not surprising that many women's studies programs rename themselves women and gender. Simultaneously, a third term, sexuality or sexualities, was joining this dyad. In part, among the more theoretically minded scholars, this reflected the influence of Foucault and contemporary psychoanalysis. In part, it was the result of the lesbian difference in women's studies. They either formed lesbian studies or joined with gay men with whom they shared the burden of a stigmatized sexuality to create gay and lesbian studies. And this, too, evolved and mutated. In 1984, the same Gail S. Rubin published a second landmark essay, Thinking Sex, Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality. And she suggested that the term gender could not adequately cover sexuality. She also urged lesbians to realize that they were also oppressed as quote-unquote queers and perverts, and they shared many of the same sociological features and suffered from many of the same social penalties as have gay men, sadomasochists, transvestites, and prostitutes. Forgive me in English, you can imagine some of the more proper lesbians disliking being associated with prostitutes. By the mid-1990s, the earlier rubric of lesbian and gay studies had expanded elastically to become lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender studies, LGBT. And simultaneously, some programs in women and gender relabeled themselves as programs in women, gender, and sexuality. American academic life has its flexibilities. LGBT studies both reflected and inquired into three human possibilities that became more socially and culturally accessible in the late 20th century. First, that of the transsexual, who transforms her or his body, medically, into that of the late opposite sex. Second possibility, that of the bisexual, who actively desires both men and women. And third, that of the transgender person, who feels and takes on the identity of the opposite gender or floats among gender identities. And in the mid-1990s, transgender became an umbrella term for transsexuals, drag queens or kings, gender people, and others who blur and cross gender boundaries, living in a psychological state in English we now call gender queer. How did you translate that?
We don't.
Okay.
We said genderqueer.
Genderqueer. All right. Displaying the porous boundaries between social change and some academic work, queer became part of vernacular speech, the name of an active subculture in an academic field, queer studies. LGBT became LGBTQ. And during these decades of change, and especially in the early decades, we often attacked the American university as racist, sexist, homophobic, and hostile to interdisciplinary work. In reality, Daniel Hostebos will remember working to get the first women's studies courses put together at Barnard College. In reality, the condition of the American university made change far easier than it would have been earlier in the 20th century. Both federal and state governments were, if led, willing to support equity in education. A number of women were now in the academy and trained to be there. Yet, they were marginalized. This indifference to their talents made them irritable, angry, and willing to work for change. But despite them, Homo academicus Americanus was in a buoyant, self-confident mood, not hunkered down, a spirit that not even the agonies of the 1960s fully dissipated. Enough faculty and staff were willing to listen to arguments for change. And as you know, after World War II, the American university had grown and become the so-called gold standard for higher education globally, attracting students, public support, and public and private monies. And indeed, small grants from foundations, especially from the Ford Foundation, were a lifeline for women's studies. It was such a different situation from European countries. Crucially, American higher education was diverse. It consisted of a variety of institutions, from two-year community colleges to research universities. There were both public and private institutions. No single ministry of education hovers over and governs them. The consequence of this breadth and diversity is a degree of institutional flexibility and freedom. So if one college or university disdained women's studies, another learned to welcome it. American pluralism in action. Now, are we ready for part two? Do we need a stretch? Okay. The close-up. I did not accidentally become an American monster. One milder than many monsters, but nevertheless bent on the relief of the body and the reconstruction of the mind. As I look back on my work, the path and its logic seem straight enough, no puns intended, despite rocks, potholes, and demons hiding in the hedgerows that line it. Perhaps a distaste for banal melodrama has ironed out the more flamboyant twists and turns of my life. More plausibly, I have been lucky. One element of good fortune was in being the child of immigrants and pioneers. No matter how subliminally, the stories of my grandfathers taught me that change and risk were possible, even desirable. Most immigrants and pioneers, no matter how grim their place of origin, have a streak of hopefulness. The future will be better, can be better, must be better. Now, again, in English, let me interject. I am deliberately excluding people forced into exile and enslaved persons. The immigrants and pioneers to which I am referring came with a certain degree of voluntarism. And I am not, though I am not in this analysis, I am not the child, obviously, of enslaved persons. I am not the child of people forced into exile. I am the child of immigrants and pioneers. Paradoxically, my ancestors' capacity for change and risk permitted them to create security, a place in the American middle class. Their grandchildren then had a sturdy platform on which to stand if they wished to dive into the turbulent waters of change. My paternal grandfather, Edward W. Stimpson, arrived in New York as a small boy. His family had fled the English Midlands for America. They then traveled across the United States, losing whatever money they had brought from England all the way. In the mid-1880s, they had a small farm in the territory of South Dakota. I have a picture of some of the Stimpsons, including a young girl in a nice coat, a relic of England, standing in front of a herd of cattle in some ramshackle wooden buildings. The blizzard of 1888 destroyed the animals. And on his birthdays, the 7 grandchildren of Edward W. Stimpson, my brothers, my sisters, and I, would act out his life, including the blizzard. Some of us imitating the sounds of the icy wind, and some of us lying on the floor with our arms and legs upright, pretending to be the frozen dead cattle. My grandfather, a stoic, who now wore 3-piece suits, would look bemused. Finally, the family ended up in a small town on the coast of Oregon, where my great-grandmother, apparently tougher and more resourceful than my long-bearded great-grandfather, ran a boarding house. My grandfather earned his way through college and medical school, all public institutions, as a luggage handler, a football player, a janitor, and a gravedigger. And just before none of us imitated digging graves in our pageant. Just before World War I, he established a medical practice in Bellingham, Washington, a small northwest town on Bellingham Bay, still so raw that the sidewalks consisted of boards over mud and dirt. Yet it was and is a place of overwhelming physical beauty, of water, island, forests, and mountains, so gorgeous that it permits one to fix one's gaze outward and upward, and it permits one to avoid the inward gaze on the jagged landscape of the self and any curiosity about the sublime. So beautiful you can be stupid. My maternal grandfather, Arthur Watts, was born in the American Midwest in a small town, Nashua, in the state of Iowa. Ambitious, smart, innovative, a first adapter of such inventions as the crystal radio. He was the first in his family to graduate from high school. He married my grandmother, who had left school when she was 12 to go into domestic service. Aware of her sweetness, he once described her as carrying within her a perpetual summer. And to earn money to go west, they sold baskets of food, which my grandmother cooked, to passengers in the train that would stop at the Nashua station. They made their way to Bellingham, Washington as well, where Arthur developed real estate and sold insurance. And my father, Edward K. Stimpson, and my mother, Catherine C. Watts, met in high school. An overwhelmingly beautiful landscape in which to wander, pioneering ancestors, ancestral examples of stoicism and a sunlight love. All this was valuable material, formation of a character who might want to take on the risks of monstrosity. My little town also offered a sense of belonging that can breed such a character when it does not fertilize the bad smells of an odious complacency. My pioneering grandparents and their like-minded compatriots believed in building 3 interlocking institutions as they made their livelihood: the family, the church, which would organize the hospital and the school. And they demanded a ferocious work ethic. Gertrude Stein, who was interested in immigration, once wrote, "It is very meritorious to work very hard in a garden, equally so, when there is good weather and something grows, or when there is very bad weather and nothing grows." My forebears always hoed their gardens and sowed their seeds. And the first 3 physical buildings they constructed were the home for people and the animals, the church, and the school, even if it was only a 1-room schoolhouse. My parents raised their children within family, church, and school. And they made 2 explicit promises to all of us. First, education would matter to our growth and well-being, spiritually, intellectually, socially, and materially. And second, that as parents, they would provide the support we needed in order to be educated. Once, as a child, I leaned my chin on my mother's ironing board and said, I want to go east to one of those women's colleges. I had, I believed, read about them in the mass circulation Life magazine. You will, darling, you will, my mother said. I had little access to movies, one of the glimpses of a larger world that provincial children had before social media. However, I had, like many of us, I had literature. I read obsessively the god Shakespeare. Literature is escape. Literature is fantasy. Literature is myth. Literature is beauty. Literature is inspiration. Literature is fact. Literature is a source of role models. I treasured a book of mini biographies of famous women, empresses, queens, authors, suffragettes, and Amelia Earhart, pioneering aviatrix. Consciously or unconsciously, it embodied a gynocentric tradition. And like many American girls, I worshipped Nancy Drew. Is she translated? Nancy Drew?
No.
Oh, too bad.
But
Girl
Louisa,
detective.
Louisa is translated.
Yeah, Nancy Drew, a female Tintin. And Jo March, the scribbling heroine of Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. And years later, I fought in the Canon Wars. And in 1980, in the essay Reading for Love, Canons, Paracanons, and Whistling Jo March, I introduced the concept of the paracanon, a group of works that persist because readers want and adore them. I was at last repaying my debt to Louisa May Alcott. Bestowed upon me was a good life, too careful, too thrifty to be the good life, but a secure, loving childhood. The more experience I have gained, the more grateful I have become. Yet Bellingham was no American paradise. American mythology, often tedious in its self-congratulations, beats the drum and flares out the tunes of individualism and self-reliance. As Ralph Waldo Emerson writes in his canonical essay, Self-Reliance, quote, "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string." He is a tonic in a conformist society. Yet how was one to be an Emersonian nonconformist? How was one to be a maverick, a bold pioneer, a possible monster, especially a female one, and still obey the decencies, regulations of family, church, and school? Was the purpose of reading to be able to enter into an imaginative space with a script that was an eagle scream in praise of being dangerously original, and then, the next morning, get up and set the breakfast table for the family and take the bus to school? If so, I learned a valuable lesson in coping with the cognitive dissonances that can lead to rebellion. But for better or worse, the institutions that sheltered me, because they sheltered me carefully, also bred an internal warning about a crash and burn rebellion against them. Later, though I was accused of being a revolutionary, I was in actuality an easily discernible reformer. Far more insidious than the tension between the American ideology of nonconformity and the American pressure to conform was the extent of activity that was either hidden or whispered about. All families, churches, schools, bars, and towns have their lies, secrets, silences, and whispers. All swear by the instruction, don't ask, don't tell. But my family believed in education. I was to pursue learning. And one of the immense contributions of feminism has been and is its devotion to apoptosis. Apoptosis is the loosening of bandages or crusts or scabs to reveal the flesh beneath. I came to a medical school to tell you this. But the primary technique of apoptosis in feminism were to be consciousness raising, public demonstrations, and the written word. And like many women, I had much to loosen and remove. My family wound itself in bandages, concealing suicide, madness, depression, and illness. And within the town we might catch a whisper about which doctor did illegal abortions, which wealthy woman was a kleptomaniac, or which man was cruel to his wife. We could not fully admit how pervasive was the benign patriarchy that reigned over us. Although my mother's mother, she who radiated a perpetual summer, did whisper to me again and again, men may work from sun to sun, but women's work is never done. And I had free access to my books. We could not fully acknowledge my brilliant mother's frustration at being a housewife and a mother many times over. Was I meant only to breed? She once asked my father in a letter written to him while he was away in the military during World War II. Such questions made him feel too sad and unloved, so they could not be repeated. Nor did her children want to hear them. We were, after all, alive, because she had become a wife and fecund mother. She had been the high school valedictorian, he the salutatorian. She had successfully run a small business until I, her second child, was born. She now had my father's lunch ready for him every noon when he came home from the medical practice where he had joined his father. And despite the patriarchal constraints on women, heterosexuality was more acceptable to both genders than homosexuality. One of my aunts, Ruth, my mother's older sister, was a professional woman, a chemist. She lived with Peggy, another professional woman. And once when I was in college, I asked my mother in the family kitchen if they were lesbian, a word I had learned in college. And for my worldliness, she slapped my face. Shall I cut this part about the demographics?
Yes, perhaps.
Okay, I'm cutting the part, but one thing is it was a white Christian town.
No Jews, no.
3 Jewish families. I learned about race because my mother read Richard Wright's Native Son out loud to me. And there were Native Americans on their reservations. The other, for Protestants, were the Catholics. And within Protestantism, the other for the Episcopalians were the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. So educated and so ill-educated, so yearning for bigger worlds and so enmeshed in the small one of Bellingham, Washington. I reversed the westward direction of my pioneering ancestors and went east to college. Of the women's colleges, Bryn Mawr was considered the most productive of blue stockings. Intellectual women. And in 1979, I published a novel, Class Notes, about a provincial girl from the West, who, guess what, enrolls in a prestigious women's college, which provides her with intellectual and social capital. Bryn Mawr and Bellingham lurked in the background. Some people at Bryn Mawr and in Bellingham hated the novel, especially my mother. But it provoked good reviews, and my favorite review was from a feminist critic in a Midwest paper who claimed I had produced the best electrolysis scene in literature. That will go on my tombstone, the best electrolysis scene in literature. I learned many things in college. Because we had no male competition, we young women ran the student organizations. I was the president of the Undergraduate Association, and some of the most important lessons were in a small, smoke-stained, smoke-stenched room over the arched entryway of my residence hall, a room, not surprisingly called the smoker. And their wildly sophisticated young women from the urban paradise of New York talked about subways and Chopin, race relations, and the forbidden name of Karl Marx. They drank black coffee and they smoked. They speculated about the college president's wooden leg. And such stimulating inquiries, no matter how ill-informed, provoked my long fascination with the theory and practice of gossip. I'm going to go on to even here, however. What does that say? Yeah. Even here, however, there was whispered knowledge about monstrosities and unconventionality. Unconventionality is the more comfortable version of monstrosity. Women loved each other and rearranged their feelings to make them acceptable. My intense relationship with my roommate would have provoked even more chatto voce, mockery, and disdain of it if it had not been so erotically muted. My formal education provided me with sound intellectual capital. Some of the faculty were squeamish about teaching in a mere women's college, even one of the lofty group called the Seven Sisters, but most of them educated their young women strenuously, without apologies, pandering, or condescension. Some male faculty slept with their students. In my years, one of them ran off with a very wealthy classmate and married her for a while. However, most of the faculty were respectful of boundaries, and they also respected intellectual tradition with a dash of the avant-garde. They assumed that women could learn intellectual traditions as well as any man. We knew little or nothing about feminism or women's history, even that of our historic college, but we did, in the cliché, learn how to learn. We were required to pass 2 foreign languages, believe it or not. Whether we painted our fingernails or not, we took at least one laboratory science course, dissecting animals or scraping at minerals in the gentle mountains of eastern Pennsylvania. Gaining my intellectual capital unsettled and baffled me. A public high school graduate, a provincial. I had to catch up with young women tutored in elite private schools. I got headaches. I wept. I was homesick. And this was not because Plato and Descartes and my geology teacher were men. It was because learning can be hard, naughty, difficult, demanding. It was because I was away from home, but when I was done, I had changed. I was changed. After an instructive dropout period, I was hired as a lecturer at Barnard in the 1960s, another private women's college. This one associated with Columbia University, the university where I was a surly graduate student. Ultimately, I was to teach at Barnard for 17 years until I moved to Rutgers, a very large public research university. I took part in anti-Vietnamese war demonstrations, and I took part in anti-university demonstrations at Columbia. I visited students in jail, attempting to talk to them through heavy yellowish plastic windows with a tiny mesh hole for voices to travel through. I then threw myself into feminism and into the then tiny movement of women's studies, that witch's coven. As a young teacher, I prepared both the first Women in Literature course and the first Black Literature course at Barnard. The memory of hearing Richard write had haunted me, and some of my earliest publications were about the complicated experience of being a white woman teaching Black culture, and about the relations, at once fruitful and fraught, equitable and exploited, between the women's movement and the Black civil rights movement. But in general, what had been inchoate was taking shape. What had been silenced or whispered was becoming audible. What had been powerful was exposed for being cracked at the heart and both fiercely resistant to change and vulnerable. What was under pressure and in pain was being relieved, and what had been constructed, sometimes well, sometimes perilously, was being reconstructed. My office mate and boon companion was Kate Millett. Like me, she was very American. She had graduated from the University of Minnesota and gone to Oxford, where she had won a first. She had recovered from a sorrow-drenched lesbian affair by living in Japan, where she had met the Japanese artist Fumio Yoshimuro. Together, they were living in wild, then ungentrified downtown New York. I moved to a loft 3 blocks from them on the Bowery, and several of the people in this room have visited that loft. I'm no longer there. She called me Stimps. I called her Kate or Millett. We were known as the two Kates. And one day she walked into the office carrying a tattered piece of mimeographed paper. Stimps, she said, there's a new civil rights organization for women. The first New York meeting is tomorrow night. Let's go. The first New York meeting, it was the National Organization for Women. And since it was so very new, few people belonged, and we became demonstrators, both against economic inequalities and cultural stupidities. Kate, as scholar, writer, and artist, was touched with genius. Raised as a Roman Catholic, she had drunk deeply from its communion cup of guilt. This had left a dual legacy. She was far more conscious of demons than I, and far more suspicious of institutions that she feared would control her psychologically. I looked far more radical than she. Robust, dark, curly hairs and miniskirts. Her hair was in a bun. She wore long skirts. She married Fumio. However, her dissertation was the famous Sexual Politics, that Syrian account of patriarchy. Mine was a competent study of a woman writer, Iris Murdoch, in her concept of character. In her autobiographies, she compares us as mavericks. She is the bolder one. However, the pseudonyms she gave me in her autobiographies were a sly, loving tribute. She calls me Morgan, after Arthurian legend and my favorite sports car, and Emerson, after Ralph Waldo. The pattern was set. We were passionate feminists. We were passionate scholars and teachers. With a member of Columbia's clerical staff, Barbara Boyne Cristiano, I would carry a model of an affirmative action plan walking between 2 rows of helmeted policemen to Columbia's president. I would also write the history of affirmative action. And some of us would try to speak in several registers to academic and general audiences. This was my motive in becoming chair of the Ms. Magazine Board of Scholars in the 1980s. And such a combination of activities and audiences characterized women's studies. And uniting our work was a fervent goal to transform all of education. And however, always conjoining the utopian hope of transformation with the belief that women's studies could eventually, was my belief that women's studies could eventually bring higher education to its senses. That we could provide blueprints and beams for a usable university. We often badmouthed and whined about each other. The founding of the Barnard Women's Center in the early 1970s was a tense affair. but our autonomy was bolstered by our sense of community as we called for a new pedagogy. Now I am going to consult with my guardian angel here. What is the 5 minutes before the questions, what's the most important? The first panel about homosexuality, the founding of signs, the work on Gertrude Stein, which, ask my audience which they would like to hear.
You're right. Everything is interesting.
Everything may be interesting, but time is short.
Yes, I think we can leave. Maybe we can leave the pardon.
Page 16.
Page 16. Page 16.
Feminist critique. Virginia Woolf and Stein and Donna Stanton.
Alors, redis page 16, c'est ça que tu veux?
Oui, on saute la page 15.
Non. Page 16.
All right, here.
Up to
the end.
Up to the end.
Up to the end?
Attends.
No, that's too much. It's too much.
Ça va faire trop jusqu'à la fin.
I have made a decision.
Là, moi je ne sais pas, mais je suis à la page 19.
The speaker has
moi,
made a
j'en ai
decision.
30. Donc ça veut dire qu'elle a fait simplement 2 tiers.
La conférencière a pris une décision.
Moi, j'ai pas lu.
This is what the speaker would like to do. With your permission. The speaker was told to speak for 90 minutes, but we were a little late. I want to leave 30 minutes for questions. These are the incidents about which I would like to speak. What it meant to be a feminist critic, and Gertrude Stein, the founding of Signs, and how Donna Stanton brought in French feminist theory. And I think that, and then my final, and then my last quotations.
No, but Kate, if we are 10 minutes or 15 minutes late, it's not.
Skip Sitsu and because we know about this, Sitsu and this.
But you can take.
They are part of our culture.
Okay.
So there is no need to stress it. And
you can take
could go
10 minutes more.
immediately to page 18. I'm not a triumphalist.
Oh, it's heart-wrenching.
However, this is no.
It's very, very
narrative.
sad.
My work is in women's studies.
Go ahead and take 10 minutes, 10 more minutes.
Non, il faut parler de science. Allez, moi aussi, je prends une décision.
However, this is no triumphalist narrative.
C'est où ça? Mais dis-moi où c'est.
Stay long?
J'ai pas le
All
français.
right.
Je pense qu'il faut parler
There.
absolument.
You see, okay, that would be here.
Okay.
Et toi, alors je sais pas.
Non, mais moi,
No. Here. What don't I do here? A pioneer wasn't an adventure?
Yes.
Okay.
C'est pas le
Okay. So I'm going to skip the part with great reluctance about the first panel about homosexuality.
Yes.
Going to skip that?
Yes, but that's very sad. I agree.
No. Do it. Lillian, you were my master. No. Do that panel.
No, but maybe you can just give you can just make a summary of
Okay.
it. Just say what it is about.
Well, but people have things to do, but okay.
Just in case the room is not that.
Okay. All right, I'm going to start going fast. All right. No, go fast. All right.
17.
I'm now starting
17.
here. Opining wasn't as an adventure? No, we're starting with in my research and speaking, I resisted too much speculation. Lots of there. What do we here?
We're losing time.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start here.
Yes.
Okay. For me. All right, I'm starting with in English. All right, we're taking up so much time deciding how to save time. Okay, I'm going to start with, in the French, can you find it?
Page 16, fin de la page 16. À la fin de la page 16, je me suis alors trouvée devant l'une des plus belles occasions de ma vie.
No, we're not doing it.
Oh, yes.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, let's go. Here we go.
In the midst of such a...
Yes.
This is what we're skipping, unfortunately. But you, Lillian, you might ask me a question about it. I am not describing the first panel at the MLA about homosexuality, but it was fun. It was in 1974. The American Psychiatric Association in 1973 had said that homosexuality was not a psychiatric disorder. So in 1974, we were on a panel and we were no longer psychiatrically disordered. I am also skipping the part about my work in feminist criticism. In lesbian studies and in feminist criticism, where I trace the roots of feminist criticism to Virginia Woolf, feminist criticism in English, and then I talk about my work with Gertrude Stein, where I've done an enormous amount of work with Gertrude Stein. All Stein scholars are very indebted to Marie-Claire Pasquier and her translations of Stein into French. And I always have been engaged with the harder stuff. First I was engaged with her life, and then I became very engaged with her experimental writings, which are really impossible. And now I say, in the midst, you find the page, in the midst of such inquiries, discoveries, and my own exuberances, I was given the most beautiful opportunity. The University of Chicago Press had, as the director of its journals division, a charming, tough, shrewd woman, Jean Sachs. She had meticulous manners and was loyal, but she lived hard. I have never drunk so much as I drank in evenings out with Jean Sachs and her husband. She was a Rosalind Russell with blonde hair. And in the early 1970s, she decided that she ought to do something for women. She came east to find an editor. Apparently, Carolyn...
Page 17, début de la page 17.
Apparently, Carolyn Heilbrunn, the author and feminist, had said no. Jean then attended a conference, the scholar and the feminist at Barnard, and met me. I had been one of the conference's primary organizers. I assume she did some background checks. Two friends in the social sciences swore to her that I could read charts and graphs, even if I came out of the humanities. She asked me, I was barely tenured. I had had this huge tenure fight. She asked me to be the founding editor of the journal. It was an irresistible invitation, for I could work with a new research that I loved, but have the support of a respected institution. Dame Nassie Stanton, in French that many of you know, and Joan Burstein in education became the founding associate editors. We had so much to do. We had to find a name. The list of names we rejected is the raw material of a stand-up comedy act. Think of Pharaohs. We had so much to decide. One of the easiest but more controversial decisions was to have footnotes. For one common belief was that there were female and male styles of scholarship. The female was lyrical and emancipatory. The male was linear, domineering, and tied up with footnotes. We thought this essentialist thinking. The job of an editor, I believed, was to find ideas and seize them, look for patterns and connections, find writers and nurture them, and to make language as elegant and lucid as possible. we would prize originality and rigor, and our austere covers signified our seriousness. We would be interdisciplinary because every discipline separately and together had to contribute to the reconstruction of the mind. We would be international because every country had women who could speak, wished to speak, must speak. And our first board of international correspondents consisted of writers from Israel, Finland, the Philippines, Italy, England, Brazil, Sweden, and Singapore. And Hélène Cixous was our first French correspondent. And conceptualizing the differences between international and global or transnational lay in the future. And because of Domna's efforts, the first issue of Signs had the first English translation of Kristeva. The fourth issue had the first English translation of Cixous. Because we did no beta testing or focus groups, we had no idea if we were to succeed. We began in faith, we began with hope, and in the knowledge that we were part of a historical movement in a society that valued academic freedom. The censorship I feared was internal and psychological, a self-setting of limits. And the movement did accept us. I was in Chicago, meeting with Jean, doing financial planning, when I learned we had over 8,000 subscribers and were in the black. I screamed. I literally screamed with disbelief and delight. This is not in the translation, but one of the subscribers was the CIA. Openly, overt. Maybe that was the name of a person. Then in the middle of our editorship, the core editorial group decided that we should ask the University of Chicago Press to find new editors after we had done 5 volumes, establishing a practice that has continued. "Why are you doing this?" asked Elizabeth Hardwick, the writer, a member of our advisory board and a contributor. "This is silly. Editors only make their name if they are there years and years and years." But we believed that the field was moving so rapidly that it would benefit from rotating editors with new perspectives. We were also feminists, schooled in collaboration and the morality of sharing, a beautiful opportunity. And though I felt deeply happy, I felt a tug. Although I was deeply happy, I felt a tug of restlessness and the compulsion to begin again and again. However, this is no triumphalist narrative. My work in women's studies both fueled and almost derailed my academic career. It did derail others. For my commitment to women's studies, combined with local political conditions and my peculiar graces and charms, did lead to that long, difficult tenure fight. The provost of Columbia University, who had gained a major say in Barnard tenure cases, imposed a syllogism. Quote, "People who have tenure belong to a field. Women's studies is not a field. Professor Stimpson is in women's studies. Therefore, she cannot have tenure." Thank you, Aristotle. If it had not been for people who actively defended me, for better or worse, I would not be in academic life today. It was, to use an American colloquialism, a very close shave. And my tenure fight was also a symptom of the culture wars that began to rage in the United States and elsewhere and continue to this day. And they are, I believe, fought over 5 great issues: the nature of the United States and its role in the world, race and racial discrimination, gender and gender discrimination, sexual norms, and the balance between individual liberty and government. Higher education matters because it maintains and produces intellectual capital, and because it recruits and trains intellectual human capital, including a national and global elite. And I have been an active soldier in the culture war since the 1960s. My inability to stay away from the battlefield is the source for whatever reputation for monstrosity I have as a crude, joyless beast of political correctness. And to oversimplify, I believe that the United States should support nonviolence, pluralism, and human rights. I believe that any sort of discrimination is wrong. I believe that sexual norms ought to be broad, and that a balance between individual liberty and government is necessary under constitutional, democratic governance. No surprises there. Nor did the other side in the culture war surprise me. For growing up in Bellingham, Washington, had taught me about baleful American conservatism, its hierarchies, its pieties, its self-indulgent libertarianism, its racism, its gun-toting violence, its wretched indifference to the poor, even when the poor might be next door. At a high school reunion, I met up with a sweet woman who had shared my locker in high school, the metal cabinet in which we stored our coats and other belongings during the school day. Yes, she said, she still believed that a wife should be subordinate to her husband, whether he was kind or cruel. And the highbrow conservatives with whom I fought in the culture wars simply had fancier vocabularies. They had less transparency about their feelings and more publicity for their smooth rantings. Now, what else you have is you have a bit about how I learned to believe that you had to do the media as well as the printed page, including the social media. I also talk next about the conflict between academic and activism, and I believe in their separate domains, though it's like pulling your fists apart. And then I talk about three people who were model intellectuals to me. Adrienne Rich, Susan Sontag, and Edward Said. They're models to me, and I was privileged to be a friend of all three of them. I also talk about how I then moved into doing more and more academic administration, becoming a doyenne?
Doyenne.
Doyenne. Becoming a doyenne, and how interesting that was. And about the condition, I talk at the end about the condition of the contemporary university.
Yes, maybe from after Emily Dickinson, that would be...
I don't mention her.
oui.
Here, right, I thought I just did with
C'est
here.
page combien?
I think right here, right?
Yes.
Yet, this is the very end.
Yes.
Let me
Page
end
21.
with, may I end with poets? Let the last voice you hear not be mine, but mine reading much better writers. Yet, this is the end. My pioneer ancestry and my feminist principles are relentless guardians of my life. One must continue to marry the will to change. I have two rubrics. One is from Rich. And in 1977, she finished her poem, Natural Resources. And at once despairing and hopeful, the poem's last lines are, quote, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And the other rubric is from Stein, Gertrude Stein. And she spoke her final words in Paris at the American Hospital in 1946, where she was about to have surgery for what proved to be an inoperable stomach cancer. According to her lover, Alice B. Toklas, in the afternoon before the operation, she was feeling worried and indecisive. "What is the answer?" she asked. Toklas was silent. "In that case," Stein said, "what is the question?" I am deeply grateful for your invitation to listen to the casting of my lots and my questions. Merci bien.